Good afternoon. First, I want to thank the Human Rights Commissions of Rockville and Montgomery County for putting on this really important event. I grew up in DC, and from the time I was 10, we lived in Woodridge near Brooklyn, just a couple of blocks from Eastern Avenue. And in the 60s, the DC side was 98% black. I walked 2 blocks across Eastern Avenue in Prince George's County, and it was about 95% white. For the most part, growing up in DC, we avoided Montgomery County altogether. I didn't get to Rockville until I was well into adulthood, even though my maternal grandfather grew up in a little town called Prathertown, not far from here. So thankfully, things have changed. This isn't a place that I avoid anymore. This isn't a place that people of color avoid. And yet, racism and ethnocentrism are alive and well. Trayvon was profiled and killed 2 years ago this month. Renisha McBride, in November 2013, 19-year-old woman, had a car accident, trying to get help, knocks on the door. She shot and killed Jonathan Farrell, 24-year-old African-American male, car accident, trying to get help, shot 10 times by the police. Racism, sadly, is alive and well. But those incidents represent one end of the continuum of racism, absolutely the worst, most horrific, violent manifestations of racism. But I think it's important to recognize that racism lives in many forms. The law enforcement officer who pulls over the Latino male driver because he looks suspicious. The store clerk who follows the black girls around because they're obviously here to shoplift. The peers who bully the kid who's different. He speaks with an accent, his skin is dark, maybe he's gay, or is perceived to be gay. The teacher who lowers her expectations of the brown child. The counselor who tells her immigrant students, you're not college material. So racism occurs in big, splashy, obviously horrific, newsworthy ways, but it also occurs in quiet, subtle, almost normal, hate to use that word, but almost normal everyday ways. As a nation, we don't acknowledge that racism still exists. That's what makes this all even more complicated. If you survey white people, and these surveys are done, and say, racism still exists, most say, oh no, we fixed that some decades ago in the 60s and 70s. If you survey people of color and say, asked, does racism still exist? They say, yeah, stupid question. Of course it does. And as a nation, there is a kind of a notion that we're beyond that. But social scientists tell us that most of us, perhaps all of us, have biases and stereotypes based on race and ethnicity. And it's talked about in sort of modern social science as implicit bias, or sometimes called modern racism. It's a different form of racism than the old school obvious, I don't like those folks, I don't want them living in my neighborhood, yeah, they're really stupid, or, you know. True, there is still some of that in some quarters, but for the most part, in 2014 in Montgomery County, we're talking about implicit bias, modern racism, people who are unaware of their biases, in fact, who say, yeah, I'm all for diversity, everybody's equal, everybody should have an opportunity. In their head, consciously, that's what they believe. But their biases, their stereotypes, leak out and emerge often in subtle and ambiguous situations where one has to use judgment to decide who's suspect or use judgment to decide who has potential. Let me give you a quick example. There's a social psychologist called John DeVidio who's done a lot of work in this area. He's currently at Yale. And this is the classic experiment that's been replicated. You give research participants resumes. You give them each one resume. There's the excellently qualified Alexandra Johnson. There's the same resume, but at the top it says Tanika Jackson. Later people will say, I assumed Alexandra was white. I assumed Tanika was black, even though the resume doesn't explicitly say. There's the very poorly qualified Alexandra Johnson, a resume for her, same resume, poorly qualified Tanika Jackson. Then there's a kind of middle ground resume, the mediocre qualified Alexandra Johnson, Tanika Jackson the same. So there's 6 various resumes, and you give research participants one of them, and you give them a job description and ask them, would you hire this person? People tend to hire the excellently qualified Alexandra. They also tend to hire the excellently qualified Tanika. They tend not to hire the poorly qualified Alexandra, nor the poorly qualified Tanika. It's in that middle group where the racism comes out. Participants tend to hire the mediocre Alexandra. And if you debrief them afterwards and ask, well, why did you hire her? They'll say, gosh, I can definitely see that there's some deficits in her portfolio. But there's a lot of potential here. I think we could work with her. People tend not to hire the mediocre Tanika. When you ask them afterwards, well, why didn't you hire her? They'll say, I can see there's some strengths here. I'm not blind to that. But, there are just some deficits in her preparation and her experiences. Gosh, I just don't think it would work. The biases come out in a subtle, ambiguous situation where the person can walk away totally unaware that their racial biases impacted their judgment. That's what we're dealing with in 2014 in the US. We also have this notion, let me back up a minute. So there's this disconnect between our conscious beliefs. I'm a good person. I don't have racist beliefs. I would never do a George Zimmerman sort of thing. And our unconscious biases and stereotypes that I would submit we all have. We also hold this notion that good people in the US don't have stereotypes. Good people don't have biases. I think that's a real problem to hold on to that notion. Good people do have stereotypes. If you grew up on this planet, you got some stereotypes. And so we aren't served well by this notion that if you're a good person, you don't have a stereotype. Because what happens is, if someone, for example, says something homophobic or something racist, and a person approaches them and says, gee, that seemed homophobic, or that seemed racist, there's a knee-jerk, oh, no, not me. I'm a good person. I wouldn't do that. And you never get the opportunity to learn and grow. So what can we do? Just a couple of things quickly. And I know we'll have opportunities to engage further as we go along. I think one of the things that we must do is to educate our children, of course, about biases and stereotypes, and do everything we can to help them not be perpetrators. And I'm not just talking about white kids with racist beliefs about black and brown kids. We also know black folks can have racist notions about Latinos, and Latinos can have screwy notions about black folks, and Christians about Muslims, and people who are fully able about people who are disabled, and people of means about people who are low income. So there are a lot of areas where we all need to, so in other words, there's not sort of the group over there who's got it and figured it all out, and then some other group who hasn't. We're really all in this together. And our task with our children is to help them not perpetrate. We need to seize teachable moments. There are many in this land, and talk to them about what's happening in the world. We need to talk to them about the pop cultural messages that they're getting and sit with them and help to not reinforce some of the negativity and venom that spews on the radio and on the TV. So there are a range of things that teachers and parents can do vis-a-vis our children. We also need to teach children about their own identity and help them to feel good and centered in their identity. When youth, whether white or black or brown or Asian, feel anchored in their own heritage and culture and religion, if they recognize a religion, and in all the aspects of their culture, they're less likely to feel insecure and defensive and fearful with people who are different. When you're solid in yourself, that person who looks different, who does things differently, isn't so disturbing or threatening. So our youth, so I would say the idea is not to assimilate, it's not to give up, it's not to teach our kids to give up their culture and heritage, it's rather to ground them in it while helping them to bridge barriers. We don't want them to tunnel in and to only look inward, but to ground them in their culture while helping them to build bridges. One of the tricky things is we want also to teach our kids about racism, but not totally terrify them, right? We need to prepare them. We need to prepare kids so that they're aware that they will experience bias and stereotypes and prepare them with how they handle that, but we don't want to scare them so that they decide to give up on the world. We also, just more broadly, need to think about how diversity is something that can enrich us. It's not just, racism is a problem to be fixed, but more broadly, we want to build a diverse and inclusive society. This isn't just, let's fix the problem. This is how do we leverage the richness of who we are. And there's some social science research that is telling us that diverse groups are more effective at solving complex problems than groups where everybody's the same. That when you get people in the room on an equal footing with different perspectives, different ways of thinking about things, different ways of relating and learning, that you can solve some of those long-standing problems of how do we create an even better educational system, how do we address poverty, how do we address sustainability. So this isn't just about fixing a problem, it's really about leveraging our gifts and our talents.